Hey folks, Matt Easton here, scholagladiatoria. So in the recent video, in fact yesterday video I put up talking about this particular mace, which is made by the English Cutler, or actually Todd from Todd Stuff, and I was talking a little bit about these sort of early medieval. That's not early medieval, but in terms of maces, they're early. So the point to remember is that in the early medieval period, that is the period between the fall of, or the leaving of the Roman Empire in Britain at least, so you're talking about 5th century-ish, through to about 1000 AD, so kind of, you know, up to the Norman conquest, maces weren't really a thing in most of Europe. Not entirely. There's some limited examples of them being around from perhaps about the 8th, 9th century, and indeed they were used in further south in Islamic areas and such like. But for most of Europe, at least in Western Europe, and again we probably see them slightly if we go to Eastern Europe, but in Western Europe, Northwest Europe particularly, and certainly in Britain, we don't really see maces again until roughly, you know, the Norman period. So you're looking at the 11th century. Why do they appear in the 11th century? Well, the argument I would make is because of the greater prevalence of armour, but it could also be that essentially they were promoted by the Normans. And now this is not something it's not a period that I'm particularly specialised in, although I studied it at school and university. I've never particularly looked at how maces came back into Europe. Now there is a possibility that the Normans, and indeed of course the Vikings, were in contact with areas outside of Europe, in southern Europe and around the Mediterranean, but also to the east of course in Russia, and you know, in contact with Persia and the Turks and so on. So it is possible that the mace kind of came back into Europe, or into Europe, as a result of contact with areas around Europe, as a result of Viking and Norman, and of course there's a connection between Normans and Vikings because the ruling class of the Normans came from Vikings originally, Rollo and all of that, for any of you who watch the series Vikings. So it is possible that's kind of, that there was a cultural reason why the mace came back, and it's not only to do with technology, and it's not only to do with the fact that there was more prevalent mail around. Completely accept that. It's not a subject that I've looked deeply into. If you want a research subject, I would say the reintroduction or introduction in the medieval period of maces into Europe would be a really interesting, probably someone could probably write a master's thesis or a PhD just on that subject. I'm sure it'd be really, really interesting. Anyway, 2 points that came up in discussing this yesterday in the comments underneath that I thought would warrant a further video. Number one, what's the difference between a mace and a club? Well, quite simply, to my way of thinking, and I don't know if this is the same for everyone, but a mace is where you have a metal or stone addition to the end of a stick, and a club is just simply made of wood. So something like a Zulu knobkerrie, for example, you would class as a club, but something like an early form of Native American stone-headed club, you'd probably class as a mace, technically. However, personally, I actually don't care about the difference between mace and club. Functionally, they do the same thing, and they're so similar that I don't think we need to get caught up on the division between one and the other. So I think it's absolutely fine to consider maces a form of club. They're a form of bludgeoning weapon, of blunt impact weapon. Yeah, okay, they might have points on them, but they're basically a blunt impact weapon. They're not a cutting weapon, and they're not specifically a piercing weapon like a warhammer would be. So yeah, by and large, I don't think there is a huge difference between maces and clubs, and certainly if you were using one, if I had one that was made entirely of wood, maybe with some lead loaded into the end, or if I was using one with a metal end, I would use them exactly the same. It wouldn't really change how I use them, so functionally there's no difference. So for me, maces and clubs are basically the same thing. The other point that came up, and this is a point that's really interesting, and again there's research to be done in this, and as far as I know, no one has done some proper academic research on this. Was the mace carried by clergymen, people, you know, priests of various sorts, because it didn't shed blood? Okay, so this is a very, very commonly stated fact, and as far as I know, there isn't, as far as I know, any evidence to back up this fact. It's something that lots of writers on the subject of weapons have repeated and quoted the last person that said it, so it just becomes Chinese whispers, and each person says it without there being any original source material that I'm aware of to actually back that up. Is it plausible? I think it's slightly plausible. We do know that you know, the clergy in the medieval period did and didn't do certain things because of their place in society. So I think it's possible that if they felt the need to carry a weapon, then for various reasons a mace or a staff may be seen as more socially acceptable than a sword or a spear or whatever. So yes, it's plausible. Does it actually make sense in reality? No, I wouldn't say too much. Certainly not with a spiky club, because this is going to shed blood, I promise you. I haven't tested it on anyone yet, but I can tell you if you hit someone in the head with this, they're going to bleed quite a lot, okay? So it doesn't matter that it's not a sword or not a spear, it's still going to cause them to bleed a lot. So that's definitely going to shed blood. A blunt-headed one, like a club, like Bishop Odo is shown holding in the Bayeux Tapestry, potentially, maybe, that might not shed blood, although I would imagine a large wooden club or a shillelagh, if you hit someone in the head, probably pretty much the first thing that's going to happen with a good hit is their skin's going to break and blood's going to come out. Even with single stick sparring that was done in the 17th, 18th century without a fencing mask on, the aim was to create a split in the opponent's scalp and cause bleeding, so even that's going to shed blood. So I don't really buy the not shedding blood argument. I think there's another aspect which is more important to the carrying maces, and that is, as some of you mentioned in the comments, status. For some reason, lost in the mists of time, maces in many cultures around the world, if you look at Persian culture or even Native American culture or various prehistoric European cultures and through into the Middle Ages, in fact, maces for some reason have some kind of status or quasi-religious significance to them, and I've never seen really a good explanation of why this should be. I mean, you know, it was even in ancient Egypt it was the case. I don't know why. You look at the even in modern ceremonies, like if you look at the British Parliament, they carry a mace. A mace is carried before Parliament and in processions and such like. And the monarchs of Europe carried an orb and a scepter. The scepter is essentially a mace. The orb represents the world, because yes, they did know the world was an orb. They knew it wasn't flat. And the scepter represents their power, their authority. Notice that the sword was used for lots of ceremonial things, but they had a scepter as well. The marshal's baton, even carried, you know, even in statues right the way up to the First and Second World War, and obviously it comes from Roman primarily sources, where Roman generals were given a baton to carry. So this idea of someone important, whether it be a king or a Roman general or a World War I general, or an Egyptian ruler, or all of these sort of people who have a very important, almost sacred role, carrying something mace-like. It's a very interesting thing. I don't know the origins of it, and I suspect it's not possible to even trace the origins of it. It's something that so many cultures have fed to each other that it's just become a thing that's passed down through prehistory and into history. So yes, I do absolutely think that maces have some kind of symbolic significance, apart from just the practicality of the fact that they are very effective against people, but particularly effective against people in armour, because, of course, as we know, swords, generally speaking, are not very effective against people in armour. So you need to change the weapons. If you're fighting against someone who's wearing lots of mail, you need to think about, okay, which weapons, and you know, looking at axes and warhammers and maces that are going to be more effective against that person in mail and gambeson than a sword is, generally speaking. So there we go, folks, the two main points that I really wanted to cover. Maces are really interesting thing and really underappreciated, and if you want one exactly like this, you know where to go. The link's below this video. The English Cutler, run by Todd of Todd Stuff, and yeah, it's a nice thing. I won't mention home defense again, but I do have another one of these, also from Todd, to show in a future video, probably the next video I do. Cheers, folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.